Let's give it up for David Gray, Photoshop for the web. Woo! Hi guys, how's everybody doing? My name's Dave Gray. I'm an instructor here at CodeCraft. I'm, I think, the original code instructor. I've been here since we opened. I teach web development, full stack JavaScript development. My background is I was born here in Boulder. My dad wrote satellite encryption software at NIST for the Air Force. My stepmom was professor of computer sciences at CU, so I wrote my first program when I was 9. Some kids learn piano. I learned Pascal and Fortran and COBOL and all those old cryptic languages. So I sold my first company to Google in 2007. We wrote the very first online e-commerce solution. It was the very first website where you could go and actually sell things online. Google bought that and eventually turned it into Google Stores. After that, I retired for a while and then got back into tech. I've been involved in about 100 startups in my life, sometimes 3, 4 a year. Worked anything from developer to CTO of tech companies. Primarily, I'm a problem solver. I like the back-end work, but I know how to do front-end stuff. But for me, it's more out of necessity, probably, than it is out of a passion. I really like to solve problems. And then I like to make them beautiful after I'm done. So I'm going to talk to you today about Photoshop a little bit. In general, I'm going to look at it through the lens of web development. Photoshop's a very versatile tool. You can do a lot of things with it. And I'm also a professional photographer, videographer. I've worked in film, worked for Warren Miller Films for a couple years making extreme ski movies. Worked pretty much every job on a film crew at some point or another. I got a couple IMDb credits, all that good stuff. So generally, I like creative things. The reason why I do this is because it allows me to create something from nothing, and I find that really satisfying. But also, I'm a musician, photographer. I like to do other creative things. So pretty much anything in the creative realm is good for me. So when we talk about Photoshop for the web, we're really talking about designing web pages, creating banner ads, creating content that's going to be distributed online and viewed through a web browser, right? So I guess the first thing we want to talk about is Photoshop is a raster-based image editing program. Does anybody know what raster means? That's correct. So if we have an 800 by 600 pixel image in Photoshop, essentially what we have is a chunk of information for every single pixel in the image, right? And if we have an 800 by 600 pixel image, then we have 800 by 600 pixels worth of information. Now, the problem with that is that if we want to make our 800 by 600 pixel image 1200 pixels wide, there's not enough information in the original file to tell the computer how to display that larger version of the image, and so it starts to do what we call fall apart. It starts to get blurry, it starts to get artifacts. That's happening predominantly because there's not enough information in the original image for us to scale it larger. When we talk about doing graphic design for print, we talk about dots per inch, right? And the idea is that a printer needs a certain amount of information to print an inch worth of image, right? And the more dots per inch of information that we have, the more accurate and beautiful our image tends to be. So when we do large format printing, we're typically printing at about 150 dots per inch. When we go to high quality, high format printing, we can go anywhere up to 600 dots per inch, or nowadays even higher. 300 dots per inch is sort of the industry standard when we're doing print work. When we're looking at things on a web browser like this, we're looking at things at about 72 dots per inch, right? So a web browser looks at things at a significantly lower resolution than we would need to see something if we were doing it for print, right? So when I take a photo with my DSLR camera, I typically get an image that's around 4,000 pixels wide. And the reason why is because when we go to print that, we need a lot of dots per inch in order to get a good looking image, right? And that 4,000 pixel wide image really will only translate to something that's probably 8 by 10 or 10 by 12 inches in print. But when we look at that on a monitor and we're only looking at things at 72 dots per inch, right? That image appears huge. Basically what we're seeing is just a lot of information that we don't need, right? So one of the principal concerns that you're going to have when you're doing images for the web is how much quality do I actually need here? And I have to weigh that against, well, I have to transmit this image over the internet, right? A 4,000 pixel wide image is going to be a much larger file, right, than something that's only 600 pixels wide, right? It's going to take longer to download into your mobile phone or into your laptop. And so when we put things up for the web, we really care about how big the file size is. And so we pay a lot of attention to the number of dots per inch that we're producing, because there's really no need to produce more dots per inch than we need when we're doing something for the web, right? Does that make sense? Yes?
So when I start Photoshop and it says 72 for the resolution, then that's
You're good to go for the web, right? If you were doing something for print, you'd want to kick that up to like 300 DPI,
right.
in which case that really big image that you have isn't actually going to print very large,
Okay.
right? Somebody have a question over there? No, okay. So that all makes sense? Cool, so let's talk then about image formats, right? Images come in a lot of different file formats. The web only supports certain image formats, right? Can anybody tell me a file format that's supported by a web browser? JPEG. JPEGs are 16 million colors. They support up to 16 million colors. So they're really good for things like photographs, things that have a lot of different color combinations and gradients within them, right? Somebody said GIF? GIF? Oh, PNG, great. PNG is also a 16 million color format, but it has an additional channel called an alpha channel, and that alpha channel enables us to incorporate transparency into the image so that we can have parts of the image that we can see through to what's behind the image, right? In a JPEG, we can't do that. A JPEG has to have a background color, right? So we can't create transparency. There's no alpha channel in a JPEG image. And that's why we would use a ping over a JPEG, is generally when you're trying to do something that has transparency to it. This is very common with logos, or if you're going to make something, for example, that you want to appear circular and you don't want to have a square border around it, then you'd want to make anything but the image itself transparent, and so you would use ping. Pings tend to be larger file formats than JPEGs. JPEGs are very compressible, which means that we can compress them down to a fairly small size, which makes that package very easy to deliver over the internet. Google recently created something called WebP. WebP is a variation of the JPEG image format, but it compresses better than JPEGs do. So if you ever go and try to steal a picture off of Google+, you'll notice that when you download it, it will come down as a WebP format image, not a JPEG image, right? You can go online, you can find a WebP converter, and you can convert that to some other format. But one, it stifles piracy a little bit, but really the reason why they did that is because WebP is a better compression format. It allows us to maintain the quality of the image while compressing it smaller, right? Can anybody name another file format?
So Photoshop won't open up that WebP?
It will not open up that WebP as a proprietary file format to Google, yes.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm sorry? GIF, all right. So GIF or GIF, right? This is a fun little debate. If you ever want to get into a fight on the internet, just go online and say GIF or GIF, and you'll be in a fight in 5 minutes. GIF is one of the older file formats. It's been around since 1996. Does anybody know the difference between a GIF and a JPEG?
GIF or GIF is a lot less colors.
That's right.
And it's really good for solid, things that are really solid. It doesn't do well gradients.
So JPEG support up to 16 million colors. That's why photographs look good in JPEG format. A GIF or GIF is a 256 color file format. It only supports 256 colors. So when we see GIFs online, they tend to be chunky, blocky. They don't have good color gradation. Why would we use a GIF? Because it has one inherent quality, which is it allows us to insert multiple images into the same file format and then run those images in a sequence so that we can create animations. So when you go on Facebook and you see those pictures that are moving, what that really is a GIF file format that has multiple versions of the image embedded into the same file, and then it's able to loop through them and create an animated sequence, right? Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Questions? SVG? Is anybody familiar with SVG? So if we want to understand SVG, we have to talk about vector versus raster. So when I said Photoshop is a raster-based image editing program, that means that it assumes that there is always a chunk of data for every pixel of the image that you are representing, right? Consequently, we can't make a JPEG bigger without losing image quality because there isn't enough information to represent a larger image. There just simply isn't enough data per inch or data per pixel to represent the image, right? Illustrator is another Photoshop program, and it is a vector-based image editing program. So the difference between raster and vector is that vector maintains a relationship, a mathematical relationship from one pixel to another, right? So when we look at a JPEG, we're saying, well, there's pixel 1, and there's a bunch of red, green, and blue information for that pixel. When we look at a vector version of the same image, what we're seeing is this pixel is green in relationship to the pixels that are around it, right? And by doing that, we can stretch a vector image and make it larger, and then mathematically recalculate the relationship between all of those pixels. And so there's absolutely zero loss in the quality of the image as we stretch it larger. Traditionally, vector images are also 256 color file formats. That's gotten better in the recent future, but in general, you're going to see vector images tend to look like clip art because they can't involve a lot of color gradation, because really what they're looking at is the mathematical relationship between colors and the distances from each other in the image. And so when we stretch it, we can just multiply all the relationships times 10 or times 20, and we get a larger image that looks exactly the same quality as a smaller image. Does that make sense? Questions?
That's awesome. I didn't know that.
So in general, we're going to see vector used in things like logos. We're going to see it used in things that are very clip arty, right? A really good vector artist can make things that look photorealistic, but in general, that's very hard to do. It requires a high level of skill in order to accomplish that, right? But so when we make decisions on what kind of images we're going to use in our web page, right, or in our web banner, we really want to think about, A, how many colors do I have to represent? If I'm only representing 16 colors or 200 colors, then vector's great, GIF is great, right? If I need transparency in my image, we're going to want to use a PNG file, and we're going to have to pay a lot of attention to the size of that file because it's going to tend to be a larger image, right? If we just want to put a photograph that looks good, we're going to do that in JPEG, right? And then we're going to compress that image as far as we can to where it still looks good online to the user, but also presents the smallest possible file size for download, right? All right, so SVG is a fairly new image format, and it's a web-based vector image format. It allows us to create vector images that can be seen by the browser, right? Another recent technique is called Base64, right? How many of you can make a web page? How many of you ever made a web page before? Awesome. So when you embed that image in the web page, right, we typically write something like angle bracket img space src equals quote quote, and we put the URL of the image that we're trying to link to in the quote quote, right? And that's how we get the image. But that image has to reside somewhere. Typically it resides on the server in a folder somewhere. Occasionally it resides on some other server somewhere, right? That's generally considered a bad practice. We call that jacking because I'm using your bandwidth to display my images, and some people don't appreciate that, right? But in general, that image has to live somewhere. And if the internet, for whatever reason, can't get to that image, we get a broken image on the screen. We just get a little gray box that says, well, somebody expected an image to be here, but for whatever reason, it's not, right? So one solution to that is Base64. So what you can do is you can make an image like a JPEG. You can go to one of these online Base64 converters, and you can upload your image to this site. And what it's going to do is it's going to encode that into Base64, and it's going to return it back to you. And what you're going to get is a blob of indescript numbers and letters that look like a bunch of mishmash jumble, right? And it's going to be a big block of text. But the great thing about that is actually the image encoded. And you can then take that Base64 code and you can just drop it into your CSS style sheet, and that image will actually live in your style sheet now. which means you never have to load that image because it's actually existing in the style sheet. Does that make sense?
Do you have to give it a special tag in CSS, or like how do you get it through?
Okay, so let's play. So I'm going to go here, and I'm going to say drag and drop an image, and I'm going to go find some arbitrary image. Oh, didn't like that one. Let's try another one. Oh, this one doesn't like them. Let me find another one real quick. All right, good old Stack Overflow. See if we can find a quick example. Otherwise, I'll show you here in a second once I sit down and get this all fired up. Okay, I'm not going to waste time on this, but I'll show you in a second. So the general idea is you're just going to get back a string of letters and numbers, and you can literally just say like in CSS you could do something like background parenthesis URL, and then you just drop that entire chunk of text in there, and that literally is a representation of your image. It's an encoded version of the image. Yeah.
I know you're going to show us, but how long is that typically?
It's pretty long. Yeah, and it really clutters up the code. Like if you're somebody who's has a hard time looking at this stuff, these will take up literally 20, 30, 40 lines. If it's a big JPEG image, it could be this long, right? But the advantage is that's the image, right? So you're literally loading the images right out of the style sheet. You're not having to actually save those images. Yes, they work with all browsers now, right? I'm seeing it more and more and more and more. So it's starting to be adopted almost across the entire industry as a better solution. But because the image is there.
Yeah, but it's also there in a folder that
No.
you have it saved in your project folder.
If the style sheet loads, your images are there. As opposed to if the style sheet loads and the images are accessible over the internet from that other folder. So it's one less step, right?
So is it just for background images or?
No, you can use it for anything. So anyway, those are the basic formats, right? Most people don't realize browsers also support bitmap files. You can actually use bitmap files. This is a holdover from like 1996. I wouldn't recommend that you ever use a bitmap image in your website, but if you ever needed to put a bitmap image. More recently, pings are starting to become dangerous. So we're going to see less and less support for ping format images in the future because pings, you can put code in a ping that's executable. I can hide a virus in a ping file. I put the virus 1,200 pixels off to the right so you can't see the code, but it's there and it's running every time you load the ping file. A more recent exploit that was developed, I'm not going to admit whether I had anything to do with that or not, but a more recent exploit that was developed was on JavaScript ad networks. We can upload a ping file that has information encoded in the shading values of each pixel, and then we can write a piece of JavaScript, and when those two meet in the browser network or in the ad network, the script looks at the ping file, is able to interpret characters that we've hidden in the ping file, pulls the characters out, and essentially mutates itself into a virus, which is then residing locally on the system and then can execute itself and do all kinds of nasty things. So we're seeing more and more people shying away from ping files because of this ability to actually embed executable code in the ping file. But for now, it's not a huge problem. You're still seeing people use a lot of pings.
Or is there an alternative for transparency?
Not really, not right now. Questions at this point?
Invent that for us?
Maybe. Questions at this point? Yeah.
So I guess I tried some of my photos to upload into the program. And it's like almost every one of my photos in current format is bigger than their 1 megabyte.
Sure.
font size.
There's a trade-off, right? There's always a trade-off on the internet. Like I said, they're very large chunks of code, right? But for specific cases, we see this a lot, like with the logo, something where there's a high degree of unacceptance with the client in not having something show up, right? So an insurance company just isn't going to be cool with their logo not showing up on the webpage. They may not care if the employee photos show up or not, but they really care if the logo shows up, right? So sometimes we'll prioritize certain content and encode it this way just to make sure that it's more available. Yeah.
But they're only allowing a 1 megabyte upload on that site for.
Yeah, there's hundreds of these.
Super long.
There's 100 of these base 64 image encoders, and you can download like a desktop version of the software that has no limits on it. Yeah, I would just keep trying different ones until.
Okay, great. Good to know.
Cool. All right, questions? All right, so this is a two-part class. I can't cover everything in one session. So in the first part of the class, essentially what I'm going to do is I'm just going to open up Photoshop, and I'm going to just go through the tools. I'm just going to talk to you about what they do, how we use them, and point out the ones that we most commonly use in web development. And then in the second part of the class, not today, but in the next part, I'll talk more about how we apply those tools specifically to things like creating style sheets from Photoshop mock-ups, or how we would make banners or buttons or something like that. If you want to stop me at any point and ask me questions, please do. Right? I'm happy to go on little tangents. I'm happy to go down little rabbit holes with you. I mean, really, this is for you guys to learn. So if there's something specific you want to learn about, just shout it out and we'll see if we can cover it. But otherwise, I'm just going to kind of go through the interface and talk to you about generally setting up, how we get started with stuff, how to build things, et cetera, et cetera. All right? All righty. So I'm going to just open up Photoshop here. Photoshop, a few years ago made the move to the cloud. So these days you just pay $9 a month. You get a Photoshop subscription. And you download it, but predominantly this software is now running off the cloud. That's really helped them because piracy was a big problem for Adobe prior to this. Everybody was just stealing it. This seems to have really cut the level of piracy down quite a bit. But anyway. No, one program for $9. I think it's like $50 a month to get the whole Creative Suite. So here's the basic interface for Photoshop when we open it up. The first thing you want to understand about looking at this, and really any desktop program, right, would be that anything that this program does down here is also up here in this bar, right? In other words, these are duplicitous or repetitive, right? In the sense that anything that we can do down here is really just a shortcut to something that we can do up here, right? So if you're trying to figure out how to do something in Photoshop, start with the top menu bar. Because everything you can do in Photoshop is accessible somewhere in that top menu bar, right? And then everything you see below is just a shortcutted version of the thing that you could get to from the top menu bar, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run down the sidebar, talk to you about some of the tools, and then just generally walk you across the top bar, and I'll just try to go over as many functions as I can in the time that we have today, all right? Like I said, if you have questions, stop me, interrupt me. It's totally fine, all right? So the first thing we're going to do when we're going to start a photo project typically is we're going to say File New, right? So if I say File New, I'm presented with this dialog menu, and it's going to ask me some questions. Do I want to give my project a title? It's not necessary at all. On large projects where you're trying to organize a lot of information, it's generally a good idea, but if on one-offs and stuff, it doesn't really matter, right? As far as document type goes, generally you're going to defer to custom. They have some preset kind of project types in here, like US Paper, Photo Web, or whatever, but for the most part, you're just going to build custom setups, right? Here they're asking us for the width and height of the image. We can stipulate that in pixels, inches, centimeters, millimeters, points, picos, or columns. When we're doing web design, we're typically going to stipulate things in pixels, right? So I'm going to create a new blank image that's 800 pixels wide and 600 pixels tall. I'm going to give it a resolution of 72 pixels an inch because that's what we do when we're doing development for the web, right? Some modern standards have been up to 96 pixels per inch for the web. but that hasn't been universally implemented yet. So for the most part, we're still coding at 72, right? So I'm going to set this up at 72 pixels per inch. I can put it into a bitmap mode, a grayscale mode, which would be only black and white, right? Or RGB color. CMY color is something you're really going to only deal with in print. So you don't really ever want to use CMYK color when you're doing stuff for the web, right? And then lab color, which you don't care about. So generally, RGB color is where you want to go. 8-bit is fine. And then the only thing we really need to stipulate is, do we want our image by default to have a transparent background, or do we want it to have some inherent background color? Here I'm going to say transparent. Once I'm ready to go, I can just say OK, and then I end up with a new 800 by 600 pixel blank image, right, on the screen. You can see that I'm viewing it here at 66.7%, right, which means I'm not actually viewing it at full screen. In order to do that, I have to go to View and say 100%. And now I'm seeing it at 800 by 600, right? Yeah?
When would we change the bits? When would there be a reason to change the bits?
For the web, never.
Okay.
Always leave it at 8.
Make sure. Okay.
Okay, so when I'm looking at this, one thing I think people don't realize about Photoshop is the greatest asset, the greatest advantage you have with Photoshop is the ability to zoom in on things down to the pixel level, right? What people don't realize is when you're trying to do work in Photoshop, the more zoomed in you are, the easier it is to do really fine detail work, and the harder it is for the human eye to detect what it is you're doing once you zoom back out again, right? So in general, when you're trying to do things, don't be afraid to zoom in and out. Learning the keyboard shortcuts in Photoshop will save you an immense amount of time. It's really, really worth it to take some time and try to learn the keyboard shortcuts, right? So for example, if I pick this tool, which is called the rectangular marquee tool, and its job is basically just to allow me to draw a shape on the screen. At this point, there's no shape here, right? It's a marquee. I've just kind of designated a shape that could exist, right? And then if I was to jump over here to this paint bucket tool, I can then fill that in with a color, right, to actually create a shape on the screen. Photoshop is a layer-based image editing program, which means that we can create multiple layers in Photoshop and have different elements on different layers, and they all just sort of stack up. So if you think of that, back in the day when I was in school, we had these things called overhead projectors, right? And the teachers would write things on clear pieces of plastic called transparencies, right, with a pen, right? What you can do is you can think of Photoshop layers as that. They're essentially a bunch of layers with transparencies on them, and we can stack those up, right, and layer them up to create our image, but also makes it easy to separate our concerns. So if we want to keep different elements on different layers, then it makes it easy to turn those layers off and only look at the things that we're interested in working on at any one particular time. Something else you'll find in Photoshop is that nowadays it comes with auto select unchecked, right? When auto select is unchecked, it's very difficult to click things on the screen and select them. And it becomes very frustrating because you feel like you can't navigate around and get anything to do anything. The solution to that is just always turn on auto select. As soon as you turn on auto select, it's actually going to be smart about the things that you're clicking on, right? So here I have a layer with this box, right? I can duplicate that layer several times, and now I have several boxes here on the screen, right? And you can see that each time I click a box, the layer on the right that's associated with that box immediately highlights, right? And that makes it very easy for me to select things on the screen. But if I uncheck auto select, then it doesn't do that, right? And this will drive you out of your mind. You will literally stop using Photoshop that day and never go back to it if you never figure out this one stupid little trick, which is turn on auto select so you can actually select the things that you want to work on, right? So hot tip, auto select. All right, so going down the left, the first tool up here.
Quick question.
Yes?
I'm not seeing that as an option in my Photoshop. Is that available somewhere?
Have you selected the very top leftmost tool on the icon bar on the left? Because it's only available in that mode. Okay. No worries. So this is the select tool, right? And when you hover your mouse over these things, it will, I'm sorry, this is the move tool. It will give you a little hint, right? And tell you what that thing's called. That's really invaluable when you're trying to Google information about how to use a particular tool, is you have to use that particular term if you want to get good information about the thing that you're looking for, right? The other thing you'll see is that there's just a little tiny arrow in the bottom right-hand corner of a lot of these. That's an options menu, right? And so if I right-click on that, I'm going to get more options for that tool, right? So any tool that has a little gray arrow in the bottom right-hand corner has additional options that aren't being shown by default, and you just have to right-click on that thing in order to see the additional options for that tool, right? So the move tool is pretty much what it sounds like. When it's selected, it allows us to click on things and move them, right? Now you can see that as I move things around, these little lines appear. These are called guidelines, right? Guidelines are there to help us figure out whether things are centered or aligned, right? So as I'm moving this around, you can see that when this one is lined up with the one next to it, I get these corresponding pink guidelines that tell me that I'm lined up, right? This is really useful when you're trying to align things like text or you're trying to set up a bunch of boxes, right? Another option is, I'm going to make these smaller really quick. Okay, now let's say I have these 3 boxes, but they're different sizes, right? And just for fun, I'm going to make this one a different color. Ooh, whoop. This one a different color. And then I'm going to select this one. I'm going to make it a different color. I'll show you how all these things work in a second. So now I got my 3 boxes, right? Now I can do this, right? I can just move them around manually and try to line things up. But the move tool has this sort of row of stuff at the top. As a general rule, when I select something on the left, the things that appear here in the top are features or functions that are specific to the thing that I've selected on the left. So you'll notice that when I change to this option, the options at the top change, right? The options at the top are specific to whatever tool I'm using on the left, right? So these are specific to the move tool, and they only show up when you have the move tool selected, which is why he couldn't see the auto select button because he was on some other tool, right? So if we look, there's all these sort of weird little things, right? The purpose of these things is to help us automatically space or align different components on the screen, right? So for example, if I take this thing and I put them right next to each other, but I take this thing and I put it way over here, right? Then I can use this to select all 3 of the boxes by drawing a box around it. You'll see that when I did that, the 3 layers that I selected became highlighted to indicate that I've selected all 3 of these boxes, right? Once I've selected more than one box, suddenly you'll notice that these are no longer grayed out, right? And what these are is these are align tools and spacing tools. So for example, if I select distribute horizontal centers, it tries to space all of the things I have selected horizontally and with equal spacing, right? This is really useful if you're trying to create things like menu bars, right? Or anything that involves a lot of elements that should all be symmetric or should all be evenly spaced, right? If I want to, I can distribute them along vertical centers as well, right? Or I can align them along horizontal centers, or I could align them along vertical centers, right? So these tools make it very, very fast way, right? So let's say, hypothetically, I want to make some buttons for my website, right? First thing I would do is I would pick the second tool down, right, which is the select tool, and I would just carve out kind of a general shape for my button. And then I'm going to go to the paintbrush tool. Oh, I'm in a text layer, thank you. Why is my thing all small now? Ah, there we go. So I'm gonna make a new layer here. I'm gonna fill this in, right? So let's say I have this thing. So I'm gonna copy it a bunch of times. There we go. So let's say these are going to be the buttons for my website. Now I could sit here and I could manually try to get them all lined up, but really what I care about is the one on the left and the one on the right, because those sort of define where the endpoints are of my spacing, right? And then the rest of these, I don't really care. They could all be just kind of jumbled up here in the middle. All I have to do is select them all and then say, let's space them out this way. Let's space them out that way, right? However it is I want to space them out, I can use these tools to just kind of do one click and have everything aligned or spaced or whatever. So that's basically what these are doing, right? Another thing we commonly do here is transform, right? Transform just means alter or change either the shape or the orientation or the position of the thing that we're working on, right? So here there's another checkbox we can check which says show transform controls. If we check that, it now gives us these little control points around the image, right? You'll notice that if I put my mouse here outside, I get a curved tool, but if I get closer to this square, I get other kinds of arrows, right? If I put my mouse right on the square, that's just a resize. It lets me kind of stretch and adjust the shape of the image, right? If I hold down the Shift key while I do that, then it constrains the proportions of the image so that, for example, if I want to make a perfect square, I just hold down the Shift key and draw a square, and it'll constrain the width and height so that they're always equal. They're always in proportion, right? And then if I go out here where I get this tool, this is the rotate tool. This allows me to rotate the thing. And again, if I hold down the Shift key, then it snaps, which makes it really easy to rotate something 90 degrees, right? Because I don't have to sit here like this and wonder if I've gotten it. And you'll also notice that right here, the actual angle of my rotation is being displayed in real time. So I could sit here and play this game until I get it to exactly 90, but at some point I'm going to jump out of a window if I have to play this game long enough, right? So I can just hold down the Shift key, and that's going to make it just snap to 90 degrees, 45 degrees, whatever, right? You can also get to the transform tool. Now you'll notice that once I go into transform mode, these two things appear, right? One is the cancel button and one is the accept button. This will make you want to jump out of your skin if you're not realizing that you're in a mode, because once you get in this mode, Photoshop won't let you do anything else until you've either accepted or rejected the changes that you're making to the object, right? So at this point, if I try to get this thing to work, it's going to ask me, do you want to apply the changes to the thing you're doing before we forget about that and go do something else, right? Nothing is going to work here until I either say I accept these changes or I reject these changes, right? So just remember, every time you're in an edit mode, there's always going to, if you see that little circle with the dash and the check mark, you got to pick one of those two before you can get back to doing anything else, right? Does that make sense? Does anybody have questions at this point? Sweet. All right. So that's basically creating a shape and transforming it, right? So we've done that both with the Move tool and the Select tool, right? If I don't have Show Transform Controls checked, I can always do Command T, and Command T will put me into transform mode, right? And that's why these shortcuts are so useful, is because they can just quickly get you to some place like transforming, right? Once I'm in transform mode, I can right-click on this object and get a wide variety of transform options, right? So scale means we're going to change the size of it. Rotate, pretty self-explanatory, means we're going to try to rotate the object, right? But we also have skew, distort, perspective, warp, content aware, and then rotate 180 degrees, rotate 90 clock, counterclock, and also flip vertical and flip horizontal can all be done just by clicking a single thing out of the transform menu, right? So if I want to distort, well, let's start with skew. So when I click skew, these now become skew handles, right? They're going to skew the shape. This is really good when you're trying to create things that look like they're in perspective, if you're trying to create shadows, right? Another thing we can do is we can pick distort. Distort lets me move each individual handle individually in any way I want, right? So in this case, now just this corner becomes mutable, or just this middle point becomes mutable, or just this point becomes mutable, right? And then the last one is perspective. And perspective will manipulate symmetrically, right? In symmetry. So if I pull this end, the other end comes along with it. So again, this is really good for creating things that look like they're in some kind of perspective, right? Does that make sense? All right, so that's the transform tool. So at this point, we can make shapes, right? We can fill them in with a color, which I'll show you in a second. We can distort them in different ways, and we can move them around the screen. We can align them. We can rotate them, right? But at the end of the day, you're still just creating boring shapes, right? The thing about Photoshop is it has these things called blending options. And blending options are really the meat and potatoes of being able to do things that are visually interesting with shapes in Photoshop, right? You're going to find those blending options when I have something selected. Oh, sorry. If I click on the layer of the thing that I have selected, if I right-click on it, I get this option for blending options, right? If you're going to spend, if you want to make things cool and interesting and don't look boring and generic, the best place to invest your time in Photoshop initially is understanding how blending options work, because blending options are the basis for all styles, all effects, right? Anything cool or interesting that Photoshop does to a shape is done with a blending option, right? So you should really just invest time in playing around with blending options, see what they do, and just trying to create different kinds of things, right? In older versions of Photoshop, when we select blending options, we simply get all of the blending options by default. In the most recent version, for some reason, they decided, let's not do that. You'll have to go and specifically stipulate which blending options you want now when you pick blending options in Photoshop. I find this to be incredibly tedious and annoying, but whatever. This is what they've done, right? So by default, this thing has a bevel and emboss, contour, texture, stroke, and gradient overlay. Bevel and emboss allows us to give things depth. It's an illusion. It's a visual illusion of depth, but allows us to create the illusion of depth on things, right? Contour and texture are components of bevel and emboss. So when we bevel and emboss something, we can also apply contours to it or different textures or patterns to it. I'll show you those in a second. Stroke simply means making a line or border around our object, right? So if I was to select stroke, and then here I get the stroke options. All of these options are specific to the stroke blending option, right? So I'm going to move this over here so you can see both things happening at the same time, right? So if I adjust the size of the stroke, right, that adjusts the size of the line that's being drawn around our shape, right? I also have bevel and emboss selected, which is why it looks three-dimensional. If I turn that off, it goes back to just being a flat object, right? With stroke, I can control the width of the line, whether it's coming from the center, bless you, the inside or the outside, how that line is blending with the other elements in the shape, how transparent the line is. Does that make sense? Its opacity is how transparent it is. And also I can control the fill type. I can have just one single solid color as my fill type, like red. Or I can pick a gradient, which would be some variations, in this case, of grays and whites. There's also a library of different gradients, preset default gradients that we can choose from. Or I can pick a pattern, right? And again, there's a library of patterns. We can also create our own patterns in Photoshop, right? Is that making sense? So when we want to draw a border around something, we would use the stroke function, right? By default, this thing is green, but if I want, I can choose gradient overlay. And there's also another option called color overlay, which will just apply a solid color over it, and I can make this thing any color I want, right? So instead of it being that, I could make it this, right? So all of these are being applied on top of the base shape, right? And anything you make in Photoshop that's going to be like a button or an icon or a banner is probably going to use some combination of these different blending options. So best thing you can do is literally just go in and play with these things. Try them out, right? Say, I wonder what happens if I apply this blending option. I wonder what happens if I make the border thicker or thinner. I wonder what happens if I apply the border from the inside as opposed to the outside, right? And then eventually you'll just sort of develop a visual vocabulary for what these things do. And then when you need to make a specific thing, when you're looking to create a certain result, right, you'll have some familiarity with the tool set. Does that make sense? Okay. So yeah, play with your blending options, super fun stuff, right? If I go into the other options for the select tool, I can see I can select rectangles. There's also an elliptical marquee tool, right? That lets me make ellipses. Again, if I hold down the shift key, it will constrain the proportions so that I will always get a perfect circle, right? So that's a really useful little thing to know is the shift key, right? And then I also have single row marquee and single column marquee if I want to make rows or columns. The next tool is the lasso tool. It has, I think, it used to have three. Yeah, it has 3 modes, right? The lasso tool. The lasso tool lets me sort of draw my selection using the mouse, right? So if I want to create a more complex shape, I can do that, right? Now imagine for a second, I'm going to open this image real quick off my computer. So imagine I have this image, right? Fox, coyote, whatever it is. It's on a white background, right? And I want to layer this, or I want to composite this with some other stuff. I want to make the coyote look like it's on the beach and it's partying with Coronas and it's hanging out with, other foxes and stuff, right? So one approach might be, well, I'll take the lasso tool and I'll try to cut this thing out, right? Now what you'll find is, even though I have a pretty steady hand with Photoshop, it's just not possible to get a perfect cutout, right? So I'm always going to end up with like some white space and stuff. It's not a particularly efficient way, right, to cut the fox out of the picture. If I had to do this with the marquee tool, however, zooming is your best friend, right? Now, at any point, no matter what tool you're using in Photoshop, if you hold down the space bar, it just lets you move around the image without actually doing anything to it, right? So when you're zoomed way in and you need to kind of slide things around, you just hold down the space bar and then you can kind of shuffle your way around to where you need to be. Now, if I'm drawing my marquee here, I can actually see the edges much better, right? And when I zoom back out again, that's actually a really good, clean line, right? So when I talk about doing things zoomed in, this is what I'm talking about, right? When you're zoomed in on the pixel level, you can do very fine work that when you zoom back out again, translates to something that actually looks like a very clean line, right? And then eventually I could go around the entire image like that. That is not the preferred way to do this, but it is a way that we could do this, right? Command D will unselect any selection that you've made. That's also a shortcut you'll use quite a bit, right? Another option in here is the polygonal lasso tool. That's going to do the same thing, only it's going to do it by connecting straight lines, right? Polygons. So while that's great for making an arrow, it's not particularly useful for cutting the animal out of the picture, right? Command D makes the selection go away. And then I have the magnetic lasso tool. The magnetic lasso tool is a smart tool. It tries to find the edge of the thing that you're trying to draw out to make your life easier, right? So if I use that, it's going to sort of intuitively help me find where the edges of the fox are, or the coyote, or whatever it is I'm working on here, right? And again, it's not perfect. It's going to make mistakes, right? But it's better than the other tool, right? So the magnetic tool is, it's a little bit smart. It's going to try to help you find the edges of something, right? Now, if I bump down to the next tool, this is an actual select tool, right? And here I have the quick selection tool and the magic wand tool. The quick selection tool is sort of like the magnetic lasso tool, only it's doing it with selection. it's going to try to figure out what it is that I want to cut out of the image, right? Now, it didn't do a great job. It missed the end of the tail, it missed the foot, it missed the tip of the ear, right? It's not perfect, right? If we had something with very straight, angular, defined edges with no unobvious color contrast, the background was just pure white and the thing was just pure black, this would work really well. I'd be able to find the edges no problem, right? Here we've got the fur is border on white, which is also the same color as the background image, right? So the tool gets confused. It doesn't quite know exactly how to cut the image out. But still, it's not a bad option, right? The other option in this case would be the Magic Wand tool. This is, again, another smart tool that tries to figure out where the borders of things are. Here we have some options, right? And one of them is tolerance. Tolerance means that the higher the number, the more tolerant it will be, right, of color variation, right? So a very low number, like 10, right, means it's very indiscriminate in the way that it cuts it out, but this actually did a great job. It was able to find the edges of this thing, right? And in fact, if I now do select and invert that selection, now I've got just the animal, and then if I did cut, I could cut it right out of the picture, right? And that's actually really good. I got 99% of the animal without any problem, right? If I wasn't having success, I would just adjust this tolerance number up or down until I was hitting sort of the right amount of tolerance to find the edge of the thing that I was looking to cut out, right? As a general rule, 32 is a really good place to start with the tolerance tool. 32 works for about everything, and then you can start tweaking it up or down in either direction if you're not getting perfect cutouts, right? So those are the select tools. Now, if I was to go online now, for example, right, and let's see, I did forest, and I'll probably get Forrest Gump before I get a picture of the woods, but let's see here. Oh, no, Happy Day. And I'm going to grab this picture, or no, this is Happy Fox picture here, right? So now I can copy this image. Photoshop's got a built-in way of saying, hey, you just copied something, you must be about to paste that into Photoshop, right? So when I say File, New now, it by default makes this new image the width and height of whatever's in the clipboard, right? So if I say OK, and then I just hit Paste, right? Now I've got my image in Photoshop. Okay, then here I'm going to undo a couple times. I'm going to cut the thing out. I'm going to go back to this image. I'm going to drop it in. I'm going to use the transform tool. I'm going to hold down Shift because I don't want to distort the proportion of the image. Right? And then I'm going to use my move tool. And I'm just going to kind of place that guy in the scene there. Right? And there we have a composite. Right? Does that make sense? Great. So that's the select tool. The crop tool is essentially going to just let us create proportional crops of our images, right? This is more of a photographer's tool. Typically, we shoot something, we want it to be in a standard image size format, like 8x10, 5x7, because that's what we're going to print it to when we make a print of the photo that we just took. And so when we crop things down, we don't want to crop an image into 8x7, because there's no standard paper size for 8x7. We're just always going to end up with white stuff around because the paper is always going to be 8x10, right? So if we're going to crop something, we want to always crop it proportionally to that 8x10 proportion, right? And so the crop tool lets us sort of stipulate up at the top here what the correct ratio should be, and then it will only allow us to draw rectangles that are in that proportion, in that ratio, right? But again, it's predominantly something you're going to use in photography, not so much in web design. Okay? This is the color dropper. The eyedropper tool lets us basically just click something on the screen and see that color value, right? You'll notice that also when I click it, down here in the lower left-hand corner, that immediately assigns that color to the color palette, right? Once it's in the color palette, I can double click the color palette and I can see all kinds of information about that color, like its hex value or its huge HSB or its RGB value or its CMYK value, right? For web design, this is really useful because I can click this and then I can see here that is the hex value I would use on my web page to get that same color to show up on my web page, right? Band-Aid tool is, again, something we typically use in photo retouching or photo restoration, right? It lets us try to repair things on the screen, right? So let's say I go on here and I do a search for fashion model. Right, so let's take an image like this, just arbitrarily. Give that a second to download. I'm going to right click it. I'm going to say copy image. I'm going to go back to Photoshop. I'm going to say file new. It's automatically going to make a new image that's the width and height of what's in my clipboard. So I can just say OK and then paste. Now I got my image, right? Command plus and minus lets us zoom in and out using keyboard shortcuts. So here I'm going to zoom into the image, get right down in here, right? Now let's say that I shot this photo and I don't know, the executive producer or the model came back to me and said, look, that was a great shot, but I got hair under my nose, dude. What are you thinking? And I got all this weird stuff going on under my lip and it's driving me crazy. Can you fix that, right? Well, turns out I can, right? Or let's say, I don't know, she had a zit or a blemish or she had some crow's feet or, you know, whatever. I've heard the gambit of things, right? Some people love retouching. Some people hate retouching. It's certainly a personal preference, right? But still, the Band-Aid tool is pretty much designed for this kind of thing, right? So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to give her a zit right there. And I'm going to make that just the worst blackhead you've ever seen, right? So let's say I shot this photo and that was actually a real blackhead on her face, right? She asked me to get rid of it. I can use the Band-Aid tool. The Band-Aid tool is one of those smart tools. It tries to figure out what's around the thing that you want to fix, and then it samples that part of the image, and then it tries to undo what's in the area that you actually want to fix, right? So typically with this, I just hold it over the area that I want. I can use the square bracket keys to make this selection tool bigger or smaller, right? So I'm going to try to make it as close to the size of the blemish as I can, and then I'm just going to click. And it's gone, right? So that's the Band-Aid tool. There's a more advanced version of the Band-Aid, or there's a less smart version of the Band-Aid tool, which is down 2. It's called the Clone Stamp tool. The Clone Stamp tool, I have to hold down the Command key and actually tell it what part of the image to sample and apply to the area that I want to fix, right? So in this case, if I wanted to extend the corner of her eye out, right, I could sample it by holding down the Command key and clicking, and then as I draw, Option key and clicking, then as I draw, it's going to use that part of the image, right, to draw into the space that I'm trying to draw into. So let's say here I do Option, select, now I can kind of pull out her eyebrow or whatever, right? So the clone tool is just a not smart version of the Band-Aid tool in that you're specifically stipulating what part of the image you want to paint onto another part of the image. The Band-Aid tool will look at what's around it and then try to fix whatever you've clicked based on the information on what's around it, right? And then pattern stamp you'll never use in your life. Let's see. History brush, never use in your life. Eraser tool is pretty much what it says it is. If I select the eraser tool, I can erase parts of the image. I can hit Command-Z to undo, right? I can set the opacity so that I'm not destroying the entire image, right? I'm just sort of deleting a percentage of the image. Flow works sort of like an airbrush. The lower the flow, the less I'm erasing, right? So if I want to do something very subtle, There's also a background eraser tool, which in my experience doesn't work. And the magic eraser tool, which is sort of like the magic wand tool, in that if I select that, it will try to select the area that you want to erase based on the shapes and the lines that are around it, right? So here, if I click in her eyeball, it's going to try to just erase parts of her eyeball that match that white tone. But it'll find edges where there's dark colors and not erase everything, right? So if you're trying to go through something and erase parts of something, the magic erase tool is really useful. The paint bucket tool lets me fill things in with colors, right? It's going to use whatever the selected foreground color in the palette is. So here, if I select blue, right, then I can go back here with the paintbrush tool and I can kind of fill in the parts that I deleted, right? Obviously, that makes for a very harsh line, but we'll talk about that in a second. The thing below that has 3 options: blur, sharpen, and smudge, right? Blur is great when you have these sort of sharp edges like this, because you can just sort of blur them out, right? Makes them softer anytime you have sort of a sharp edge. Another great thing you can do with blurring is if I want your eye to focus on a particular part of the image, I can achieve that by just blurring out other parts of the image, by making them softer. And then what happens is the eye just naturally gets pushed to whatever's in the clearest focus, right? So if I really want you to pay attention to her eye, then what I can do is I can just sort of blur out the rest of her face a little bit, right? Blur out the thing that's pulling your eye right now, which is this really intense earring, right? And what you see happening is that now the eye is just sort of naturally driven to the thing that's in focus, right? So using blur as a way to push the eye to the thing that you want the person to look at is actually a really effective tool. We use this a lot in sales. You'll notice this more and more and more when you're looking at product images. They'll tend to blur everything out except the thing they really want you to focus on in that product image, right? It's generally done very subtly, so you won't notice it unless you're paying attention, but it works. Okay, the other one is the sharpen tool. It does exactly the opposite of what the blur tool does. It brings things into sharper focus, right? You can see if you go crazy with it, it will actually destroy an image, right? And now my computer's going to need like a couple minutes to think about all of that death and destruction. There we go. Right, and then the last one here is the smudge tool. Smudge tool can be really useful. I used to run a photo lab, and I used to have people bring in a lot of photos they needed restored, like photos that were damaged, had big chunks missing, or were taken during the Civil War or something, and were just all beat up. So, one thing we would do is we would sort of go in here, and I'm going to use the erase tool really quick, right? Let's say we would just sort of like there was a missing chunk of the image for whatever reason that had gotten ripped off in a flood or something, right? We could use the smudge tool, and essentially what we're going to do is we're just going to try to push what's around it into the empty space, right? And again, the closer you are zoomed in, the less obvious what you're doing is when you zoom back out again, right? But for example, if you just need to fill that in there, like most people would not notice that right away, right? And that's better than just having a whole chunk of the image missing. Yeah?
How are you changing the size of that circle?
The square brackets. The square bracket keys. So if I hit the right square bracket key, it'll get bigger. And if I hit the left square bracket key, it'll get smaller. Right? There's also a chooser up here, which you can pull down and use this size slider. And then hardness will determine how hard of an edge your tool has, whether it's kind of a soft blurring effect on the edge or whether it's just really crisp and hard. Right? And then down here, there's a whole bunch of different brushes. So like if I wanted to do this with a fan brush kind of effect, right? You'll notice that's adding these sort of streaky lines. Right, but if she was the Flash and I wanted to make her look like she was moving 800 miles an hour, right, I might sort of pull that off the back of her hair, right, and give it sort of a, like, whoosh, wind is blowing, right? All right, so that's those tools. Below that is Dodge, Burn, and Sponge. These come from traditional photo developing. Dodge makes something brighter. Burn makes it darker, right? And then the Spudge tool just kind of adds a blotchy texture to it. Again, this is a really common technique when we want to pull the eye to something, right? If we want you to focus on her face, then the best thing we can do is use the Burn tool and darken up what's around her face, right? Because the lighter the contrast, the more the eye will pay attention to it. So you can see already where the eye is going now. Right? I've really pushed the focus now to her face because I've darkened the tones of the rest of the image, right? So these are really common techniques for trying to drive the user's eye to a particular part of the image, right? This is the pen tool. You could easily invest 100 hours in the pen tool and still never be good at the pen tool. The pen tool is very annoying, but essentially what it does is it allows you to create line by line different shapes that you can then transform into selections, right? The best way to work with the pen tool is just practice. Read tutorials online, but essentially it's just making points that are gonna connect up on the screen like this, right? Like if I wanted to make that the selection, right? And then I would hit enter or escape or whatever, and that would convert it into a selection, and then I could cut that part out of her face. I find the pen tool extremely aggravating. The T tool is the text tool, right? You'll notice that when I click that and I click on the screen, I get a new layer here on the right, which is different than the other layers. It's a text layer, right? And it's specifically for font. All of my font options are up here, right? So if I wanted to say like, wow, this is so groovy, right? And then again, if I don't click select, A, I can't use any of the other tools, and B, this change will not be finalized, right? I have to actually say, yes, I want that, right? Now I have this font. Now at this point, I can Command T if I want to apply transforms, right? I can scale it holding down the Shift key to keep it proportional, or I can not use the Shift key and I can make it not proportional, right? I can also Command T and get the transform options. Warp is now an available option, right? Once I select warp, oh wait, let me do this, and then Command T, and then warp. I don't know why it's not giving me warp. But warp will let you push around different parts of the image, right? In more of an individual section by section way, right? It's really good for distorting things, or if you have something that's straight and you're trying to give it a little bit of shape to make it look like it's in perspective, or you're looking at it from an angle, warp would be a really good tool for that, right? That's weird though. Oh, there we go. So here are my warp options. They just updated this. This is different than it used to be, right? And then I could pick like arc, but now I can sort of stretch my text, make it curved. I can change the horizontal shapes. I can make it wrap around a circle or something if I'm doing a circular logo, all that good stuff, right? And then here I have the shape tool. The shape tool is a way to make shapes, and it has a lot of presets, which is why people like it, right? So if we want to make a rectangle or a rounded rectangle, something with rounded corners, or an ellipse shape, or a polygonal shape, or a line, or we have this custom shape tool, right? So all of these are pretty standard. If I select rounded rectangle tool, I can just draw a rounded rectangle on the screen. And then I can come over here and I can apply different blending options to it, right? So I could bevel and emboss it, give a little bit of depth, and then maybe a stroke so it has a border, and then maybe change color to a gradient. Right? So those are just sort of standard shapes. But then they also have this custom shape tool, which I think a lot of people find really useful. And it sort of has a library of pre-built shapes that we can use. So if you come up here on the right, there's this little drop-down menu, and it has a bunch of different options, right? So if we need to make an arrow, for example, we can just select the arrow key, and then now we're going to draw arrows, right? Or if we want to do a light bulb, now we're drawing light bulbs, right? All of these have this weird tiny little gear icon in the menu, right? That's how you get to more options, or how you would load options, right? There are tons of free libraries for styles, for shapes, for brushes that are all available online. If you're not familiar with DeviantArt, DeviantArt is a site where a lot of artists hang out and give away stuff that they make. You can find literally thousands of free shapes, free brushes, free add-ons for Photoshop on DeviantArt. It's a great resource. But let's say I wanted something that wasn't here in the options that I had, right? I could select this little gear icon, and then I could go down here, and you'll see there's a bunch of other libraries like animals and artistic textures and film and frames and music and nature and objects and whatever, right? If I pick one of these, then it's going to ask me, do you want me to replace all of the selections you have with what you just chose? Or do you want me to just append what was already there with what you just chose on the end, right? So if I say append, it will keep the existing options. It will just append more animal-related options onto the end. This library will stay like this as long as Photoshop is open, right? And once you close Photoshop, it will revert back to its default set of selections. Then you'll have to play the game all over again unless you use the preset manager, in which case you can go in here and stipulate what is the default set of selections for options every time Photoshop opens. And then you can also create sets and save them and name them so that, you know, if you had one project where you're working on maps a lot, right, you would create sort of a map shapes library that you could load up when you were working on maps. But when you're working on web pages, you probably don't want to have to weed through 200 map shapes, right? So you would not load that library. You would load a different library. Does that make sense? How am I doing on time? Should I wrap this up? Okay. So that gets us basically through this. We got the move tool, which basically just lets us move stuff around. And then we have the magnifying glass, which lets us zoom in on things. You can achieve that just as easily by using Command plus and minus. Right? And that's the tool set on the left. Right? You guys have any questions? Yeah.
If you found a photo, you know, on one of those celebrity magazines or whatever, or anywhere, can Photoshop decrypt the Photoshop features off of that photo, or has it just been saved as a file that
It has to be saved in PSD format, which is the Photoshop file format. When you save it as a PSD file, all of these things, the layers, the features, the bells and whistles, all get saved along with it. And then when you open this up on another computer with Photoshop, it will have everything in it. The minute that you save it as a JPEG or a PNG or a GIF, you've done what you call flatten it, which means you've essentially stripped away all of the extra Photoshop information, and now it's just the file format information. And at that point, it's lost.
And then would an image that has been photoshopped, if uploaded to, converted to base 64, would it have more code?
No, because you can't convert a PSD file to base 64. You'd have to convert it to JPEG or PNG or something, at which point you've flattened it, stripped away all the Photoshop information, and just have the color value information there. And then when you base 64 it, it's just going to convert it as if it were a JPEG. The one exception is PDF, because Adobe owns the PDF format and also owns Photoshop. You can also save Photoshop files as PDF files and still preserve all of the editability of the file, then reopen that PDF in Photoshop and go back to editing it as if it was a Photoshop file. But that's the only exception that I know.
So one should be careful if something's gonna go out onto the web, not to save it as a PDF file if it's been photoshopped, because you don't want viewers.
That's correct. You're giving me the source file when you give me the PDF. Cool. Other questions?
I was just gonna, when you load a vector graphic into Photoshop, it automatically rasters.
It rasterizes it. Photoshop can't deal with something as vector.
I noticed because you had, because you pulled up the, not icons, but the little graphic images, and you're able to stretch them out and stuff, and that would be kind of vector-based, wouldn't it, or is that just calculated by Photoshop?
No, you could think of anything shape-based or that you create that didn't start out as raster isn't raster until we save the file. So a shape that we make can be resized with no loss of quality because it's never been represented as pixel information. It's just, it's not vector, but it might as well be. For all intents and purposes, it might as well be in Photoshop, but those are only applicable to the features that are coming from inside of Photoshop. So that wouldn't translate to a vector you'd made in Illustrator and then tried to bring in here. That doesn't translate. Questions? Yeah.
How would TIFF file formats play into this? I mean, or is that more for printing, I guess?
Yeah, TIFF is not commonly used. Well, it's not browser supported. So for web design, we would never use a TIFF file. But it's a predominantly on a much older file format. We saw that used like a lot in the 90s and early 2000s, but we don't see TIFF much used anymore. But you can work with TIFFs in Photoshop. You just can't do anything with them on the web. Yeah. Anything else?
Any other questions, guys? Let's give it up for David.
All right. Well, I appreciate you coming out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. That was fantastic. Just want to remind everybody, actually, David was the first one to set it, and just want to remind everybody, that is session 1 of 2. We haven't set the date for the second session, but please stay, tuned in on our meetup page and on our website, devfaction.com. And let's just enjoy the rest of the evening with pizza and beer and mingling. All right, thanks. Let's give it up again. All right. Wonderful evening. Thanks, guys.